You're in for a treat with Corey. This was a guy that kept me giggling all the way through the speaker's dinner. If you have time later, ask to see his driving license photo. He's a bit of an interloper here. He's a DevOps guy at a front-end conference. But it's good for us. We need to have perspectives. We need to get fresh perspectives from outsiders too on the tools that we are using every day. And it just so happens that Corey's also a bit of a poet. Corey Quinn.
Two branches diverge from Git. It's sad I could not commit to both. I merged the branch less traveled, and now all builds are broken.
Just one moment.
Of course. We can pause it. Other side. There we go. Can you hear me now? All right. Sorry? All right. Now that they can hear me, two branches diverged in Git. And sad I couldn't commit to both, I merged the branch less traveled by. And now all the builds are broken. There we go. As mentioned, my name is Corey Quinn. I'm usually a traveling consultant. Sometimes I manage site reliability teams, but historically I am a DevOps person. And as evidenced by my slides, I know virtually nothing about front-end design or good taste. That said, Git does tend to be one of those unifying areas that ties a bunch of different areas of engineering together. And it's a unifying factor that we can all appreciate or hate as need be. This talk originally started as a class that I built called the Screaming Horrors of Git, Git for Systems Administrators. For most of my demos, I'm going to be using Git on the command line. I know a lot of people at a front-end conference like to have a UI on the front, and that's fine. But this sort of serves as a unifying influence. It's universal. Note my Twitter handles on the bottom of all of my slides. Please feel free to tweet at me. I'm always thrilled to get feedback and questions, including but not limited to what the hell is wrong with you. All right, so let's talk about Git. I'm going to start with a promise that everyone here is going to learn something today. I don't care if you wrote Git yourself. You're about to learn how I mistreat your baby. One thing that I do want to call attention to is that I'm about to make fun of an awful lot of boneheaded, stupid things to do in Git. But everything that I'm about to make fun of, I've done myself in production. It's always fun to build a talk based on failures you've caused. Okay, so let's start at the very beginning. Who here uses Git? Who here wants to use Git? Who here's raising their hand because they're staring at their phone and want to pretend they're engaged? Hey, a few honest people lurking around. Fantastic. So what Git does is it tracks changes to files and directories over time. It gives us a sense of history. It lets us collaborate with each other. It's very simple. Git is... All right, is that better? Okay, you can hear me now? Good. We'll try that.
I'll be around.
Thank you. I knew you had a purpose. Now, Git is very simple at its heart underneath all of this, which is invariably why in these presentations, the next slide looks something like this, which I find to be about as clear as mud.
Yes, please hold. Please pause. Your call is important to us. It will be answered in the order received. Are we good?
No.
All right, we better now? Hey, it works better when it's turned off. There we go. There we go. Okay. Where were we? Yes. In every Git presentation, people tell you it's very simple, and then the next slide looks a lot like this. Because there's an elephant in the room. Let's go ahead and introduce it. No matter who you are or what you do, at some point, Git is going to send you scrambling for the internet for help. The only question that remains is how far down the Git rabbit hole you can get before that sinking feeling hits. So why does this simple tool get so complex? Apropos of absolutely nothing, Git was written by Linus Torvalds, who's famous for three things. First is writing Git, which is why you're all listening to this talk. The second is creating Linux, which is why a fair number of people in this room are employed in the first place. And, of course, tearing people to pieces on a variety of mailing lists. Git, despite its complexity, Git does let you do very, very powerful things. Powerful, of course, being a polite euphemism for stupid. There we are. For example, we take a directory here. We create a Git repository. We then tell it to add the contents of the directory, and then it hangs. This is usually your first warning sign that something is a little bit remiss in how in something you're doing. For local operations, Git is designed to be extremely fast. We're going to ignore good sense in this case. So we make a commit. And it tells me that it has now successfully committed a large ISO into the Git repository. Now, if we do a quick size check on the directory, we show that we have now, with one file in a new repository, have now 173 megs under management. This is less than ideal. So let's fix that. So we tell it to go ahead and remove that file from its copy of the repository. But we notice that it's still enormous. The reason that it does this is that Git keeps a snapshot of every commit going back in time. So even if that enormous thing is not in the current version, it's going to exist historically in the rest of the repository. You can commit large binaries to Git. You can commit atrocities in Git. For those of you who are of a design bent, who do want to start committing large static assets instead use one of these two tools. They're designed to solve the specific problem of I have a large binary blob, and it's obnoxious to work with these things inside of a Git repo. Joey Hess, a Debian developer, wrote Git Annex, and GitHub was one of the pioneers behind Git LFS, and they both tend to work the same way. You store the binaries somewhere else and then just store a pointer to that inside the Git repository, which helps keep it to a relatively sane size. Now, most of us aren't committing large binaries into Git after the first time we do that and get yelled at by people, but we're often committing things we shouldn't be, like secrets. Generally, if you have committed something to Git that you don't want there and have pushed it to a shared repository, the way to remove it, you have two options, neither one of them pleasant. The first is an arcane command called git filter branch, which requires about 16 lines of arguments to do what you want it to do. And there's shall we say, beefier version that runs in a Java runs under a JVM that is called the BFG, which is Git filter branch backwards. Now, some shops do manage to sanely store secrets in Git, but they take the semi-sane step of encrypting them first, which generally tends to make sense. Let's move on to another terrible idea. I don't even know what this is. Remember how I said that Git can make almost anyone's head hurt? So we go ahead and create a Git repository. Inside, it creates a subdirectory called .git, which is where all of the objects, data, and metadata for the repository live. And if we take a look at this, it's relatively straightforward. There's repository-specific config, there's a hooks directory, there's a head file that points to what your revision is currently checked out, and of course, all the objects live there. But all these are just files and directories that control the Git repository. You can manage those. There's a tool I like to use for that. This actually works. I'm not entirely sure why you would do this, but you can. Okay, how often has this happened to you, where you wind up starting to type a command? Now, personally, I'm a full Stack Overflow developer, so that means that my development methodology of choice is copying and pasting code from Stack Overflow into production until it works. So let's pretend the answer that I'm looking for here is git status for whatever reason. So then I go back and paste it in. And it yells at me because obviously I have one too many git words in there. However, if you take a very short shell script and move it into your path, you'll find it works. But you can go deeper. Git, choo, release train is leaving. Something very similar to this could be used to make Docker a reality, but we're not quite there yet. So Git does have its own alias support. In other words, you can wind up in your git config file, have a bunch of relatively complex commands that you don't want to remember, so you can alias it to something shorter. The problem is that these aliases all have to start with the word git if you want that interpreted properly. So if you want something a little bit more complex, you have to break it back out into the shell itself, like this. Why in the world would I do this? Great question. I would like to stop and point out for a second that you invited me to speak here. This says more about you than it does about me. Make better choices. Okay, let's talk a little bit more about Git. I feel like this really belongs on the Git marketing page. We've all heard about rebasing master and then force pushing it, the hilarious prank that everyone can enjoy. It changes history so that everyone else working on that same repository is suddenly not working on what they thought they were working on. They say that a group of ravens is called a murder, a group of whales is called a pod, and a group of developers is called a merge conflict. Remember, I work in operations. I don't generally have time for that. I use this because it's simpler. We really are the Department of No. Yeah. On a more serious note, if someone does something like this and pushes this to something you care about, you do have a few options. You could do a force push from a good copy to wind up sending that up. You can revert the commit. You can hurl them screaming from the roof of your office. It's really going to depend on your exact situation and how many stories your office building is. So we've covered reasonably well the fact that Git can make us feel stupid. Let's talk for a minute instead about how Git can help you feel smarter instead. You ever wind up typing something like that, and it winds up spitting back an error message of, did you mean status? Well, you can have Git help you in this case. For example, and I'll expand what I'm doing in a second to show you exactly what this does. Okay, so if we rerun that command, it tells me that I'm calling a command that doesn't exist. And it's going to continue under the assumption that I meant status. And I have 0.8 seconds to frantically hit Control-C before it destroys something I love. What that command does under the hood is it's calling the git config argument. And we're then passing it the global flag. There are 3 places Git will put its config. The default is the repository specifically on the machine that it's in, which is great for confusing the hell out of people. Slightly more nefarious is --system, which sets it in etc git config, which leaves your coworkers in the hilarious place of trying to figure out why the behavior is different on that one node. And the global option puts it in the .git config in the user's home directory, which is usually where people store their personalized git config. Help.autocorrect turns on it will go ahead and automatically run this. And the number you pass it is the number of tenths of seconds it will wait for you to kill it before it destroys your life. So if you set this to 80, for example, you get the 8-second long wait where you can just contemplate maybe learning to type would have been a good idea at some point. It's the weight of shame. Now, this is awesome, but it doesn't solve everything. It doesn't get everything right. If I type in git C, for example, it's not going to do anything. It's just going to work on things where there's only one suggestion. Git C, it could be git config, it could be git commit, it could be git checkout, it could be a bunch of other things. So how many times has this happened to you? Not the typo, that happens all the time anyway. Where you add a repo, you attempt to push, and it comes back, well, you didn't set an upstream tracking branch, and it irritates the hell out of you. So you type profanity into your terminal, and then it works. This is not just for Git, by the way. It's the ultimate do what I mean, not what I say command. Sometimes even more impressive than the fact that what it does is the fact that this is the #1 result on Google when you search for the term the fuck. Amazing SEO opportunity. That's better than anything technical that they've done. Okay, joking aside, I do have a few legitimately useful Git tools that I want to present today. Let's face an uncomfortable truth for a second. Speaking as a once and future manager, some of us have a disturbing propensity to present like semi-intelligent squirrels frantically running around looking for something shiny. At a previous job, for example, I had just taken over the department and there was a monitoring board on a screen next to my desk. It was an old iMac that was now displaying stats that had no bearing on anything. I wanted to have something visually appealing to trick people into making the fatal mistake of having a conversation with me. But there needed to be something to draw them in. And I didn't have a whole lot of time on this because building a realistic monitoring solution is something that takes a little bit more thought than 90 seconds. So I wound up coming up with something a little bit different. It's called Gorse. This is an open source project. All you have to do is install it. It tends to live on for a number of platforms. It is freely open source. I'll have a link to it later on. And what it does is it reads the entire history of the repository and then goes ahead and runs a visualization around this. There we are. And you can take a look through the history of what happened, how these things work. You can pass it different arguments. And what was interesting about this was that as we started seeing this visualization on a loop of the entire history of the company, people would come up and start telling stories about it. You'd see one of the founders come in and make changes to a bunch of files. And then the first employee would come in and immediately revert all of those changes to that set of files. And you'd wind up people telling stories about, remember when we brought that module in? What a mistake that was. And it turned into, I guess, a basis for shared storytelling, which made for an interesting and sometimes amusing conversation. So that's Gorse. So audience participation time for something else. Who here has more than one Git repository that they care about? Take a look around. If you see people not raising their hands, they work at Facebook. Ask them if they're hiring at the end of the talk. But the rest of us have to live here in the real world, where you do things like get on a plane and realize you're missing a copy of the repository you really care about, or you've just made a bunch of changes to a week-old copy because you've forgotten to update something. Mark Atwood posted a reasonable solution here. You just punch a find command into a for loop to find the Git repos, iterate over it, fetch the latest changes in the parent of the directory that you find, and at this point, people's eyes are glazing over because this is awesome except for the part where it's shitty, because you have to type it out or remember it. I might do something like this once, but I'm flat out not going to do this every time. So I tweeted back at him. I took the painful loop, but instead of having to do the git fetch, I wound up instead running mr register. And he responded saying, "This is an awesome tool, thanks." The reason I bring this up is not entirely just for my own self-aggrandizement, but to point out that he is the head of open source relations at HP at the time when it was one company. And this is a man who has forgotten more about software than I'll ever know. And he still didn't know about this. And I guess the point I'm trying to make here is that we all have these holes in our knowledge that other people have an obvious solution to, that if we were to share it with them, everyone would say, oh. Sometimes in the Q&A, people say, well, I have a really dumb question. And people around are like, yeah, that is a dumb question. But when they get an answer, those people are taking an awful lot of notes on things. We're usually not the first person to encounter a particular problem, particularly in something as widely used as Git. And it's important that we start having some of these conversations to help spark the, oh my God, that's amazing conversations that sort of spark epiphanies for the rest of us. So, let's talk about what MR is and does. They changed the name because it turns out that MR is really hard to Google for. The problem is that I still think of it as MR and not my repos, because they've taken the hard problem in computer science of naming things and then made it worse by renaming something. So not every distribution or operating system has the same name change yet. So it's a simple process. Step one is to run mr register inside of a repository that you care about. You can automate it with that crappy loop that was on the board a few minutes ago. You can do it by hand. It doesn't really matter because you've only got to run it once. After that, it's going to build a configuration file in your home directory. The second step is to run mr update and just watch as it goes through all the repositories it knows about and updates them in series. For example, if I run mr list, it tells me right now that I'm managing 8 different repositories. If I go into a subdirectory, it's only counting 4 now because it looks from where it is down through the rest of the file tree. That's how you can handle rudimentary groupings in these things. There we are. And if we take a look at the config, it's relatively basic. I wind up including a few repositories that I care about, But I'm also have an include as the third line down, where I can stuff a bunch of other files that it can wind up inheriting. So when I work for a client or a company, I can have a single file with all the repositories for that node. I want to point out that this tool doesn't just work with Git. It supports a bunch of other things as well. You'll notice that almost every version control system in widespread use is on that list except for Perforce. But patches are welcome, which is the open source phrasing for go away kid, you bother me. I wouldn't know anything about this tool if a friend of mine hadn't told me about it. And it's important to start talking about some of these things that other people hadn't considered before. Docker, for example, absolutely nails this. It's like the inverse Fight Club. The first rule of Docker is never shut the hell up about Docker. Same model works. One of the other tools I want to show you is called VCSH, which is a version control system for your home directories. Who here has a global dotfiles repository that they keep their configuration in? Okay, yeah, a series of hands are going up. Good. Usually looks something like this, which is fine, except for there are aspects of this that are not ideal. For example, if I'm trying to get multiple machines going, a work machine and a personal machine, I don't necessarily want the Git repo that contains my unencrypted AWS credentials, because I have one of those, because I still do terrible things in Git, on my work machine. And I don't want the work credentials on my personal machine because that's how people get sued. So what I use instead is VCSH. And it shows me that I have a number of different VCSH repositories here. Let's take a look at Vim for the sake of argument. I give it the name of the repository, and I type VCSH, the name of the repo, and suddenly I'm inside of a Git repo. However, I haven't gone anywhere. I'm still located in my home directory. And if I take a look at the files that it's managing, it is only managing the Vim-specific files here, plus a git ignore, which in this case just has the asterisk inside of it. It's a wildcard, just so it can ignore everything. Now, to get around that, I do have to forcibly add files with a -f flag the first time I do this. But as a direct result, I can make all these changes to it, make commits, pull, push, do all kinds of branching. And when I'm done, I get out of it, and I'm right back where I started. As another example for my ZSH config. In this case, I'm managing a whole different set of files, but I'm still in the same place. What this is doing under the hood is it winds up checking out the repository into a subdirectory in my .config directory. There's a whole subtree under there that in turn winds up checking files from that repository out into a centralized directory where you can have multiple Git repos controlling the contents of the same directory. Historically, one of the only other ways to address this is using Git submodules, which is such a terrible idea, I didn't include it in this talk. And I'll have a link to this in a second as well. I do have two last tricks that I want to show you that I guess I've been showing you throughout most of this presentation without explicitly calling attention to them. The first if we take a look here, note that it tells me that there's master, and then there's a red dot with a 1 next to it. If I run git status, that tells me that there's already a change to be committed. Typing, how does it work? Okay, so then I go ahead and I make the commit. That red dot changes to a green check mark, but now there's an up arrow and a 1 next to it. If I run git status again, it tells me that my branch is ahead of origin master by 1 commit. I go ahead and push it. Now it's master, green check mark, and git status in turn tells me that I'm up to date. This tells me if there are merge conflicts. This tells me what branch I'm working on. And the reason this is important is it provides a subtle reinforcement that I am where I think I am, that I'm not accidentally committing to the wrong branch, that there's not a merge conflict that I'm about to wind up committing and breaking builds somewhere. It's just very handy to wind up doing things with this. There are 15 different offerings for this. Mine is ZSH specific, but there are a whole host of them available for Bash as well. If you use Fish, it may even be built in. If you use something else, I'm sorry, you've gone where I can't. The last thing that I want to show you is I haven't really been running Git this entire time. I've been running a different command. I alias Git to something called hub. Hub is a command line utility that GitHub puts out. I know that GitLab is working on something very similar, which may have already been released. But it's a wrapper script. Anything that it doesn't understand itself that is GitHub specific, it passes through to the Git binary. But it does provide a series of GitHub-specific commands. So I can fork things. I can wind up submitting pull requests from the command line. This winds up building very automatable and repeatable workflows. I tie things like this into Jenkins sometimes if I don't want to go through the full API automation piece. I can start building very simple scripts because I'm a very simple person. So trying to do the complex stuff that you all can do with code doesn't end the way you hope it would for me. So I'm going to leave this up. Feel free to grab a picture of that. That is a link to everything that is non-standard that I mentioned today, and a couple of fun things I didn't. For example, Git Hug is one of the more interesting ways of learning Git. It's a Ruby gem. If you install it and run it, at the first time it'll build a directory called Git Hug. Run into it, and you wind up being taken on a 45-level adventure game. Going from the very basic, here's how you go ahead and add a file to the staging area, here's how you commit it, all the way on up to much more advanced things, such as rebasing, exploring the ref log, doing git bisect, and effectively falling down the rabbit hole of confusion that is Git. So, does anyone have any questions, comments, snark? Your resume disguised as a question.
I think we got this one working? There we go. First of all, I think a round of applause for that fantastic talk. And now let's have out the questions.
There we are. I know someone's got a Git question out there.
I've got one.
Wonderful. What have you got?
What is the one tool that you consider most indispensable?
In a context of Git or in the larger context?
Let's do context of Git first.
Okay. For me, we're going to go with Git subcommand. For me, it'd be reflog. If you wind up going into any, where did it go here? Yeah. Just for fun. We'll go there. I'll go ahead and create a new branch, check out to it, make a commit. And I run git reflog. What this does is it tells me what branch I was on, what I checked out, when I made a commit. It gives me a local history that will run since the last time this stuff was garbage collected out. So when I'm looking at a strange Git repository problem where I get to perform different levels of surgery, this is usually the first thing I look at. Second useful approach for those situations, if you don't know what happened to the directory you're working in, make a copy first, then start exploring. Otherwise, you can make things exponentially worse and have no way back without a lot more digging into Stack Overflow.
Oh, I know that so well. And
Yes,
actually, on that, how would you approach it in Git when you are working with somebody else's on a different branch and they've added a new feature or something, and you want to pick out various commits for that? What is your chosen path for doing so?
There are a few ways to do it. Cherry picking can work, but it's easy to wind up dropping things on the floor. Sometimes rebasing them into logical commits as well, so that I can just grab that one commit that winds up being done. Rebasing is fine if you're talking about a feature branch and that isn't being widely being worked on by large numbers of people. It's because if provided you're of course running on a short-lived feature branching model. If you're trying to fall down the well of everyone's working on this one branch because there's no sane branching strategy in place, rebase-based workflows are likely to cause massive problems, and that's where people tend to run into trouble.
So what's your preferred branching workflow strategy?
Great question. The answer is it depends on the rest of the team. That's not an area that I tend to have strong opinions on because it's more important that whatever strategy you pick in an environment works for you. It's not something I'm willing to be prescriptive around because what works really well for my last team would probably work disastrously for my next team. It's the sort of thing that it's more important that you have a shared and cohesive model that everyone's on board with than it is to have the one right way of doing things that aggravates everyone.
Do you think there are any particular, because I know a lot of different organizations, such as GitLab has their own workflow that they have loads of documentation on and diagrams and things like that, which makes it quite easy to understand. And so it's quite nice to have these kinds of setups where people are kind of giving you advice on this is a workflow that works. Do you have any that you think are particularly good?
Yes. Facebook wound up creating a tool called Fabricator, spelled with a PH, because of course it is. It's written in PHP, but don't hold that against it. It's an interesting automation framework around this, where it automates a lot of the sticky parts of a rebase-based workflow so that your history is just an unbroken stream of commits, but it handles the automation piece against rebasing a feature branch, landing it on. It's a useful but sometimes complex level of automation that works really well when you have a single repository with tens of thousands of people working on it at once. That tends to create the need for additional tooling outside of what Git tends to offer natively.
Has this brought up any questions from anyone else? I can ask more. I can go back. Actually,
I see a hand over there. Fantastic.
Hiding behind the pillar.
You mentioned that Git submodule is so bad you don't want to talk about it, but you have a little time. Why do you hate it so much?
What about Git submodules specifically?
Yeah, Git submodule, yes.
Yes, the big problem I have with Git submodules is not that the technology itself is terrible. I think it is, but that's beside the point. The reason that I have trouble with it is because it is complex, confusing, and it's not at all obvious to the rest of a development team what is going on. Because you're in a Git repository and working happily, and then you go into a subdirectory and suddenly you're in a completely different place, different branch, different repo, and it's not at all clear what happened. And it's difficult as teams tend to grow and expand and sometimes more junior people come aboard. It is not at all intuitive or simple for people to grasp what's gone on. I have a strong bias towards simple workflows and easily understood code. I'm not a big fan of being clever. That's how I wind up tripping over myself. Git blame, for example, I alias it in my config to git shame because that's how we use it. Because it's always fun to go back and see what complete moron wrote this piece of crap 6 months ago. And then you find out that it's you. So you fix that and you never speak of it again. Someone created a similar tool called Git blame someone else, which winds up changing, it spits out a command of what commit, who's the new committer for this. Great. Then they say, this person is now responsible for that commit. You are officially an asshole. You can go ahead and push it, and it works, but things like that also make it very important to understand why it's important to do things like signing your commits if you're in an environment with a jerk who would do something like that, like me. Other questions? There we are.
Fab, we got a mic just over here?
It's the exercise portion of our afternoon.
Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you for your talk.
Of course.
So what I didn't understand, it's okay, there are terrible ideas with Git, but what's actually the alternative? Or do you think we need to reinvent the wheel, or do we need to start something new?
Great question. I will say that Git has improved. I'm not necessarily as a tool, but in the level of baseline understanding across the environment.
I'm not here to argue passionately for Mercurial, which tends to act as almost a simplified Git, or say we're going to roll back the clock and I'll go back to Subversion. I think that Git's a fantastic tool. It underpins a lot of existing technologies out there, but it's important to understand what some of the failure modes look like and become used to at least a baseline level of competency with running Git in a day-to-day basis. I mean, realistically, you can get a list of 5 or 10 Git commands, and that'll see you through years of work before you have to go deeper. Once you wind up in a really strange situation, hey, we're back to Stack Overflow again. But in 2016, I cannot in good conscience recommend going down a different path or creating a whole new model of version control just because it's a shared understanding. When you talk to a company, they tell you one of two things these days. It's either, yes, we use Git, or, yeah, sorry, we use this other thing instead. Because they know they're doing something nutty. It's not... At this point, there's no solid alternative that I could decently recommend. I've done a fair bit of work with Mercurial myself. It feels like a broken version of Git. It just tends to warp a little bit differently. And when you're learning Git for the first 6 months or so, it's difficult and confusing and obnoxious, and then you feel something snap, which means you're either having a stroke or you understand Git, or very possibly both. There's a correlation there, and afterwards you just sort of get it in a way that you didn't necessarily before.
Thank you.
Of course. Yeah. Other questions?
Oh, there's one here.
Oh, wonderful.
Hi. So I know a little bit of command line, but my company uses source tree.
Yes.
I mainly use that. Is there other GUIs that you like, or?
I hear good things about Tower. I hear passable things about, for example, you use Vim Fugitive if you're using Vim. RubyMine does some integration work as well. I think Atom does a lot of stuff. It's going to depend at that point on your editor and what the integration looks like. The reason that, I mean, personally, that I fall into command line is, remember, I have a history as a systems administrator. No matter what I log into, I'm going to have the command line utilities available. So that's the background I came up with. The problem I've had in the past with various Git GUIs is you move a button or you hide a feature or expose a new one, and suddenly you now have an interface, a paradigm shift, around something that, let's be honest, is already confusing to begin with. I find it tends to almost act as a bit of a red herring. But as far as can I recommend an awesome tool that'll change your life in Git that's visually appealing, not really. I mean, my slides look like crap as it is. I'm not the person to talk to about anything remotely involving something that looks nice.
Thanks.
I'd add to that from a design point of view, because I used GUIs for ages because I was very intimidated by using the command line. But actually, when I did start using the command line for it and having to look up the commands and things like that, I did get a better understanding, which made it much easier to communicate with other people on the team about what we were doing as well, and much easier for them to fix something if I managed to blow it all up.
Right. It's easier to say I ran this command, then this command, then this command versus, well, I hit the button that looked like a chicken being hit by a car. And yeah, it's difficult to articulate in some cases, because if I'm on the end of that phone call, I have no idea what you're talking about.
What's your opinion on where you host your repositories and centralized systems like GitHub?
Yeah, great question. Most of my dot files, I have a droplet of DigitalOcean that I wind up running Gitolite 3 on, which is pure command line. If I wanted something that actually I need to collaborate with others on, I'd probably go with something like GitLab. GitHub Enterprise is kind of nice, but for personal stuff, it is tremendous overkill. For stuff that you want to actively collaborate with in an open source community, it's hard to disagree with going with GitHub, just because that is the de facto standard across the board. That said, there are some interesting options appearing on the horizon. Things like Bitbucket is starting to offer some hosting, and you're starting to see at least some competition in that space. But these days, it's hard to argue that GitHub is far ahead of the rest of the pack in 2016. 2017, whole different ballgame. We'll see what happens then.
Cool. Does anyone have any further questions? Okay, well, let's step slightly outside of Git. I want to just ask you a couple more, I think.
Oh, go for it, by all means,
We've
please.
got you here and you're a fountain of knowledge. Why not?
Of course.
So stepping slightly outside of Git, and we were talking about earlier tools that you find indispensable.
Yes.
So in the rest of the working day, is there anything that you think that people here might also benefit from that you use a lot?
Great question. For me, it really comes down to being comfortable and being able to work in an environment that makes sense to me. My workflow isn't necessarily going to make sense to anyone else, and vice versa. I worked in a shop where some of the developers used RubyMine all the time, which made some sense since it was a Ruby shop. But the challenge with going down that path is that then as some of them transitioned into writing JavaScript, it turned into this editor doesn't work very well in this model, and if I try to edit something on a machine that's either in a virtual machine or on another node, that started to cause some challenges. Aside from the strict regimen of version control, I will say, as much shade as I throw at it, I am starting to become a bit of a fan of Docker, because it solves nicely for the problem of, well, it works on my machine. Well, great, back your shit up, because your laptop's going to production is not really a helpful response to that. So it helps reduce the boundary between things that the environment that you're building something in, and now we're throwing it on 10,000 servers and seeing if it works the same way. So that tends to help.
That's good. Do you have sort of one Git tip that you think is the most important thing that people could take away today?
That's a good one. I'm assuming don't isn't really the answer you're looking for here. I would say, if nothing else, what I would say in every environment is make sure that whatever, oral tradition you have around Git, spend 10 minutes, throw it in a README in the repository or something like that, because every shop has a subtly different model where, take GitHub for example. In some shops, you wind up needing write access to a repository so you can do a pull request on that. In other shops, they want you to fork that repository, make your changes there, and then pull request against the repository of record. Both of those make sense, and if you go the wrong direction in one of those shops, someone comes and screams at you really fast. Like the InfoSec people, what the hell are you doing with this? Why would you possibly fork that? Do you have any idea how dangerous that is? No, but okay, we'll go with that.
Corey, thank you so much. It was a fantastic
No,
talk.
thank you. I hope that everyone enjoyed this. If so, please remember to rate me highly on Twitter, as well as the conference app. Remember, I'm Corey Quinn, and this is Terrible Ideas in Git. If you didn't like the presentation, my name is Martin Split. I look about like this. I have a charming German accent, and this talk was called The Life of a Pixel. Thank you very much.